What happens when one uncomfortable question turns an easygoing celebrity interview into the most awkward live TV moment of the year? Make sure to subscribe to Fame After Hours and like and comment for more talk show coverage. The audience is applauding as Matthew McConaughey walks onto the stage with a familiar smile, greeting Ellen with a handshake before taking his seat. Ellen laughs. "It's always good to have you here. Somehow, every conversation with you ends up going somewhere unexpected." Matthew smiles. "Well, that's usually because you ask unexpected questions." The audience laughs along. Ellen leans forward. "That's fair enough. For the first several minutes, everything feels relaxed. They joke about travel, family stories, and funny moments from movie sets. Matthew shares an amusing story about getting lost while driving through Texas because he ignored his GPS. The audience laughs loudly. Ellen interrupts with a grin. "So you're telling everyone not to trust technology?" Matthew shrugs. "I'm saying don't trust yourself when you're convinced you're smarter than the map." More laughter fills the studio. Everything appears completely normal until Ellen changes direction. "So, you've been speaking a lot lately about authenticity." Matthew nods. "I have. And you encourage people to stop pretending. I believe that." She pauses for a second. "So, do you think Hollywood is full of pretending?" The audience quiets slightly. Matthew answers carefully. "I think every industry has performance." Ellen smiles. "But Hollywood especially?" He hesitates. "I think people everywhere can confuse image with reality." Ellen presses again. "So is that a yes?" Matthew smiles politely but doesn't immediately answer. "I think it's more complicated than yes or no." A few audience members clap. Ellen keeps going. "But you've criticized celebrity culture before. I've criticized parts of it. And you're still part of it." "I am. So isn't that contradictory?" Matthew chuckles softly. "It would be if I claimed perfection." The audience reacts positively. Ellen smiles but doesn't completely move on. "You've said people should speak honestly. So let's be honest." Matthew's expression changes just slightly. "I'm trying to be." "Then tell us something people in Hollywood don't want viewers hearing." A brief silence spreads across the room. Matthew laughs politely. "That's a dangerous setup." Audience laughter follows. Ellen continues. "No, seriously." Matthew shifts in his chair. "I think a lot of people already know the answer." She interrupts. "No, I want your answer." He pauses again. "I don't really come on shows to expose people." The applause is mixed with quiet murmurs. Ellen nods. "So you're protecting them?" Matthew immediately responds. "No." "Then why not answer?" "I'm protecting conversations from becoming headlines." Some audience members clap. Others stay silent. Ellen glances toward the audience. "But headlines are part of this business." "They are. And controversy gets attention." "It does. So why avoid it?" Matthew smiles again. "Because attention isn't always valuable." The audience applauds louder. Ellen lets the applause settle. "So you think television rewards drama?" Matthew answers calmly. "I think people reward drama." Ellen tilts her head. "So we're all responsible?" "I think we all participate." The audience grows noticeably quieter. Ellen smiles, but her tone becomes firmer. "Some people might hear that as you blaming audiences." Matthew immediately shakes his head. "No, I'm saying we're all human." "But isn't that avoiding accountability?" "I don't believe so." The exchange begins feeling less playful. Ellen folds her hands. "You become someone people look to for wisdom." Matthew laughs. "That's probably dangerous too." Audience laughter breaks some tension. But Ellen doesn't laugh this time. "If someone asks whether talk shows create fake moments for ratings, what would you say?" Matthew looks directly at her. "I'd say every show chooses what highlights." "And yours?" "We're choosing this conversation." A noticeable reaction comes from the audience. Ellen smiles. "So, are you suggesting we're creating something here?" Matthew calmly answers. "I'm suggesting every interview has choices." The room grows quiet again. A producer can briefly be heard laughing off camera. Ellen glances toward the side of the studio before returning her attention. "So if tomorrow's headline says this interview became uncomfortable," Matthew gently interrupts. "Then Maybe people should watch it themselves instead of believing the headline. The audience applauds loudly. Ellen smiles again, but there's now a visible tension that wasn't there minutes earlier. She takes a sip from her mug and quietly says, "Interesting answer." Matthew nods. "I thought so too." The applause fades, replaced by an atmosphere where everyone seems to sense that the conversation has shifted into something much more serious than either side originally expected. Neither host nor guest appears angry, but the smiles have become measured, the pauses have become longer, and the audience can feel that every next question carries a little more weight than the last. The audience settles back into their seats, but the energy in the room has noticeably changed. The earlier laughter has faded into quiet anticipation, with everyone waiting to see where the conversation goes next. Ellen gives a polite smile and lightly taps her mug against the table. "Well, Matthew, you've certainly made everyone think." Matthew smiles back. "I hope that's not a bad thing." She responds with a laugh. "No, but television usually moves a little faster than thoughtful silence." A few audience members laugh. Matthew nods. Maybe silence deserves a little more airtime. More applause follows. Ellen leans forward. "So let's talk about honesty." "Sure. You've built a reputation around saying what you believe." "I try. But sometimes people say honesty is just another way of being controversial." Matthew thinks for a second. "I think honesty without respect becomes noise. And respect without honesty? It becomes performance." The audience reacts with another round of applause. Ellen smiles. "You always have a quote ready." Matthew laughs. "I wish I did. Sometimes I'm making it up while I'm talking." The audience laughs with him. She changes direction. "You've spent years giving speeches about purpose and living authentically." "I have. So let me ask directly." He nods. "Go ahead. Have you ever sat in an interview pretending to enjoy it when you absolutely didn't?" The audience laughs. Matthew smiles. "I'm sure everyone has." "So that's a yes." "I'm saying we're all human." She interrupts. "But I'm asking about you." He pauses. "Yes." The audience laughs louder. Ellen grins. Finally, a direct answer. Matthew smiles. "It wasn't that difficult." She keeps going. "Have you ever walked into a show thinking, I'm only here because my publicist told me to come?" The audience reacts with surprised laughter. Matthew glances toward the crowd before looking back. "I've definitely had days where I was tired. Tired isn't a question." "No. So," he smiles carefully. "I've also had days where I discovered conversation I didn't expect." Ellen notices the answer avoided the center of the question. "So that's another polite way of saying yes?" Matthew chuckles. "That's a polite way of saying life changes." The audience applauds again. She shifts in her chair. "You really don't like giving headlines." "I like conversations better. But headlines sell conversations. Sometimes they replace them." A quiet murmur moves through the audience. Ellen decides to become more direct. "So let's imagine something." Matthew nods. "Okay. If a host deliberately asks difficult questions to create uncomfortable television." He smiles. Hypothetically, would you consider that manipulation?" Matthew waits several seconds before answering. "I think intent matters." "So, if ratings are the goal?" "I don't know someone's heart, but you can judge actions." "I can observe actions." She presses again. "And what would you observe?" Matthew keeps his voice calm. "I'd observe whether people are listening or simply waiting to create conflict." A few audience members clap immediately. Others stay completely silent. Ellen smiles politely. "You think conflict gets manufactured." Matthew answers softly. "I think all media makes choices." She gestures around the studio. "Are we making one now?" He looks around before answering. "I honestly don't know." The room becomes noticeably quieter. One audience member starts clapping, but quickly stops when nobody joins. Ellen folds her hands together. "You know what's interesting?" Matthew waits. "You've answered almost every difficult question by expanding it instead of narrowing it." He nods. "Life usually expands. But viewers sometimes want yes or no." "I understand that. So let's try one." She pauses dramatically. Do you believe celebrity interviews are real? Matthew smiles slightly. They can be. Can be isn't yes or no. They can also be rehearsed. The audience immediately reacts. Ellen raises an eyebrow. Rehearsed. Prepared. So prepared answers. Sometimes. Prepared questions? Sometimes. She looks directly at him. Prepared emotions? Matthew pauses longer than before. I think people sometimes arrive with expectations. The audience murmurs again. Ellen glances toward the producer's area for only a second before looking back. So, if something emotional happens on television, Matthew quietly says, it may be genuine, and it may also become larger after people discuss it. She smiles. You really know how to avoid stepping into traps. Matthew laughs. I've stepped into enough of them. The audience laughs with him. Ellen suddenly changes her tone. So, tell me honestly. I'll try. Have you ever regretted coming on a talk show? The audience becomes completely silent. Matthew looks down briefly, then back up. I've regretted moments. Specific interviews? I've regretted my own words. So that's not a no. He smiles politely. It's also not a yes. Ellen exhales and laughs. I knew you were going to do that. Matthew laughs too. I warned you. The laughter briefly lightens the atmosphere, but there's still a visible tension underneath it. Ellen takes another sip of water before speaking more seriously. You know what viewers love? What? When people finally stop being diplomatic. Matthew nods slowly. I know. So maybe today's the day. He sits quietly for a moment before replying. Or maybe today's the day we prove disagreement doesn't require hostility. A wave of applause spreads across the audience. Ellen smiles, but the expression is more restrained than before. She quietly says, We'll see. Matthew simply nods. The cameras remain fixed on both faces, capturing a silence that somehow says more than either of them has said out loud, leaving the audience with the unmistakable feeling that the conversation is approaching a point where neither side will be able to stay comfortably neutral for much longer. The silence hangs over the studio for several seconds before Ellen breaks it with a small smile. You know, this might be one of the quieter interviews we've had. Matthew smiles back. Quiet isn't always uncomfortable. No, Ellen replies, but television producers usually get nervous when people stop talking. The audience laughs softly. Matthew looks toward the crowd and says, Sometimes people are thinking. That line earns another round of applause. Ellen nods politely, but doesn't let the moment settle. Let's try something different. All right. I'm going to ask a question, and I'd like the first answer that comes to your mind. Matthew laughs. That's dangerous. For both of us. The audience laughs again. She starts with something easy. Favorite place to disappear for a week? Anywhere without my phone. Coffee or tea? Coffee. City or countryside? Countryside. Spotlight or privacy? Matthew pauses noticeably longer. The audience immediately picks up on it. Ellen notices too. That one took longer. Matthew smiles. It deserves longer. So, I appreciate opportunities. I value privacy. She presses again. If you had to choose one. He answers calmly. Privacy. The audience applauds. Ellen raises an eyebrow. And yet you're an actor. I know. So, why choose a career that guarantees attention if attention isn't what you want? Matthew folds his hands. I chose storytelling. And fame came with it. Exactly. So, do celebrities complain too much about fame? Matthew gives a thoughtful smile. Sometimes. And sometimes. Sometimes people underestimate what constant attention feels like. The audience remains quiet. Ellen changes direction again. You've been interviewed hundreds of times. I have. What makes a bad interview? Matthew answers almost immediately. When nobody is listening. The audience applauds. Ellen responds with a small grin. So you think I'm listening? I think you're asking questions. And that's different? It can be. A ripple moves through the audience. Ellen leans back. Explain. Matthew keeps his voice measured. A conversation changes when both people are curious instead of trying to win. No applause at first. Then a few scattered claps begin. Ellen notices them. So you think somebody's trying to win today? Matthew quickly shakes his head. I'm talking generally. She smiles. A very convenient answer. It happens to be true. She laughs quietly. You know, viewers are probably yelling at their screens right now. Matthew chuckles. I hope they're enjoying themselves. She glances toward the audience. I think they want something bigger. He nods. I understand. So let me ask something personal. Go ahead. Have you ever felt misunderstood by the media? Absolutely. In what way? Matthew pauses. When people decide who you are before they've actually listened, the audience applauds again. Ellen follows immediately. But isn't that exactly what celebrities do with interviews too? Matthew looks at her for a second before answering. Sometimes. So both sides arrive with assumptions. Sometimes they do. The room grows quieter. A producer can be heard encouraging applause from offstage, but the audience remains mostly silent. Ellen notices the unusual mood. This is interesting. Matthew smiles. I agree. She folds her notes and places them on the table. I'm going off script. The audience reacts instantly. Matthew looks amused. Were we on one? Laughter breaks out across the studio. Ellen smiles. You tell me. Matthew laughs politely but doesn't answer. She asks another direct question. If someone leaves an interview halfway through, what do you think that says? Matthew considers it carefully. It depends why they leave. If they feel disrespected, that's different. If they simply don't like difficult questions, that's different too. So context matters. Always. Ellen nods slowly. But audiences don't always get context. No, they get clips. Exactly. And clips become headlines. Exactly. She looks directly at him. So if tomorrow a 15-second clip goes viral, Matthew finishes her sentence. It probably won't tell the whole story. A wave of applause fills the room. For a brief second, attention softens. Then Ellen asks quietly, have you ever walked away from a conversation because you believe continuing would make things worse? Matthew's expression becomes more serious. Yes. Professionally? Yes. Personally? Yes. Would you do it again? If staying means nobody's listening anymore, maybe. The audience goes completely silent. Ellen studies his expression. So walking away is a weakness? No. It can be wisdom. It can also be avoidance. So which is it? Matthew smiles faintly. Sometimes you don't know until much later. No one applauds. The silence itself becomes a reaction. Ellen slowly picks up her mug, but sets it back down without taking a sip. I think people expected fireworks today. Matthew responds gently. I think people often expect certainty. She looks directly into his eyes. And if certainty never comes, he answers without hesitation. Then hopefully honesty does. For several long seconds, neither host nor guest says another word. The cameras remain on both of them while the audience watches with complete attention, sensing that something unresolved still hangs in the air. Offstage, staff members exchange glances. A cue card is lifted and lowered again. The planned rhythm of the segment has quietly disappeared, replaced by a conversation that feels increasingly difficult to predict. Ellen finally turns toward the audience with a measured smile. We're going to take a very short break. Matthew simply nods, offering a polite smile of his own. As the applause sign lights up, the clapping begins. But it's uneven, hesitant, and filled with the unmistakable feeling that everyone in the room is wondering what will happen when the cameras return. When the show returns from break, the energy feels different immediately. The applause is still going, but it's less coordinated, like the audience is unsure whether to restart the same mood or wait for something new. Ellen sits back down first, adjusting her notes with a calm expression that doesn't fully match the tension from before. Matthew follows a moment later, still composed, but noticeably quieter than at the start of the interview. Ellen smiles toward the camera. Welcome back. The audience claps, but softer than before. She turns slightly toward Matthew. So, before the break, we were talking about walking away from conversations. Matthew nods. Yes. Ellen tilts her head. Do you feel like this conversation is still productive? A small laugh comes from the audience. Uncertain, not amused. Matthew answers carefully. I think it depends on what people are hoping to get from it. Ellen doesn't break eye contact. And what are you hoping people get from it? A pause. Honesty, he says. The audience applauds lightly. Ellen leans forward. Some people online are already saying this interview feels tense. Matthew gives a small, knowing smile. That's usually decided before it's watched. A few audience members react with applause. Ellen nods slowly. That's a fair point. She glances down at her notes. Then back up. But let me ask you directly. Do you think I've been fair to you today? The studio goes quiet. Matthew exhales softly, thinking, I think you've been direct. Ellen immediately follows. That wasn't the question. A ripple moves through the audience. Matthew nods again, more serious now. Then I'd say you've been challenging. Ellen holds a silence for a moment. And is that fair? He replies calmly. Fair isn't always comfortable. The audience claps louder this time. Ellen smiles slightly, but doesn't fully reach her eyes. Interesting answer. She shifts in her chair. You know, I've hosted thousands of interviews. Matthew nods. I believe it. And most of the time, guests leave smiling. A small laugh from the audience. This one feels different. Matthew responds quietly. Different doesn't mean wrong. That gets a stronger applause. Ellen looks out at the audience. Let's do something simple. She turns back to him. If you could say one thing to people watching right now, no filter, no interpretation, what would it be? The room goes still. Matthew takes a moment, then leans slightly forward. I'd say don't confuse a moment with the whole story. A strong wave of applause spreads through the studio. Ellen nods slowly. That's a good answer. A pause. But people will still clip it. Matthew smiles faintly. They will. And they'll still argue about it. They will. Ellen folds her hands together. So, nothing really changes? Matthew shakes his head. I didn't say that. The audience quiets again. He continues. I think conversations still matter, even if they get reduced later. Ellen studies him for a second. Even when they're misunderstood? Especially then. A long beat of silence. Then scattered applause. Ellen exhales lightly. I'll be honest with you. Matthew nods. I hope you are. She gestures around the studio. This is the part where normally I'd wrap it up with something light. A small smile. But I don't think anyone here feels like that would fit anymore. A few laughs from the audience. Matthew chuckles softly. I agree. Ellen turns toward the camera. So instead, I'll just say this. She pauses. Matthew watches quietly. This show is about conversation. And sometimes conversations aren't neat. She looks back at Matthew. Thank you for not making it neat. A soft reaction from the audience. Some applause, some murmurs. Matthew nods. Thank you for not making it easy. A stronger applause rises this time. Ellen smiles, then leans back slightly as the audience continues clapping. Well, I think we're done trying to solve everything in 1 hour. Matthew laughs lightly. I think that's wise. She gestures toward him. Matthew McConaughey, everyone. Applause grows louder as the camera pans across the audience. Matthew stands, shakes Ellen's hand. It's professional, but there's a noticeable pause before he lets go. As he walks off set, the audience keeps clapping, but now it feels mixed. Some energized, some unsettled, some still processing what they just watched. Ellen watches him leave for a moment, then turns back to the audience with a small, controlled smile. Online, clips begin circulating almost immediately. Some call it the most intense interview of the year. Others say it was just two strong personalities having a real conversation. Hashtags trend within minutes, with people arguing over who won, even though neither side ever treated it like a competition. Back in the studio, the applause finally fades, but the conversation continues elsewhere, on phones, on screens, and in opinions that won't settle anytime soon. Before the screen cuts away, a final reminder appears for viewers. Share their opinion in the comments, and subscribe to Fame After Hours for more real talk show stories.